Okay, I think we'll begin. Susanna Goodin is a fourth-generation Texan, which she feels is a bold admission in the state of Wyoming. And she often travels back when she has time to the family ranch in Texas. So always good information to have. There are your secrets out. At any rate, she received all of her graduate degrees in philosophy from Rice University in Houston, including a doctorate in philosophy. And like Jeff, she also straddles the philosophy department with women's studies, where she works with such topics as feminist ethics. She had a sabbatical last year, during which she spent a whole year studying John Locke's theories and approaches to science. And she has received numerous awards for teaching. And I'll probably embarrass her, but I just think it's outstanding. She has received the College of Arts and Sciences Top 10 Faculty Award twice. She was also received the award of Top Professor from Mortarboard Board twice. She has been the Case Wyoming Professor of the Year. She has received an award for Extraordinary Merit in Teaching, and she's received the Elbogen Teaching Award at the University of Wyoming. We have also been privileged to work with her at the Wyoming Humanities Council. She has organized several book discussions, including one entitled Being Good, The Nature of Human Goodness, which I almost wish she were talking about today. She has also worked with us on a program called Humanities at Work, which is an ethics seminar that we have done across the state with the medical and legal profession. And Susanna has served in partnership as a humanities scholar with the professional, legal professional, or medical professional. She also has been a consultant for 2 Kaiser ethics grants, one Science, Ethics, and Fraud, and she has also been involved with the Kaiser grants in terms of teaching feminist ethics to women's studies interns. So interesting background all of these people have today. She will be addressing the topic, the scientific revolution from alchemy to chemistry. She will be providing us a 25-year overview, and that overview will help us perhaps fathom why our current approaches to science, which you have just heard a lot about this all day, may indeed be outmoded in 100 years. So it's an interesting way to conclude the program, and we welcome Susanna.
The one thing Marcia forgot to mention is that the reason I'm the last speaker is because I am a philosopher and we are obnoxious. And no one would come back after a philosopher talked, so they've put me where I can do the least damage. And it's true, philosophers are obnoxious, and Jeff has now joined the philosophy department and has become significantly more obnoxious. And we value that highly. The reason, and also I am not mic'd except for the video camera. If you cannot hear me, raise your hand because I can speak much louder. So I need to be louder? No problem, I'll be louder. Now, the reason philosophers are obnoxious is because our job is to make you question your beliefs. I don't care what you believe. I only care that you have thought about your beliefs and that you hold your beliefs for a good reason. So whatever they are, your business. I don't care. Now, Bertrand Russell, a very famous philosopher, wrote an article called The Value of Philosophy. And the value of philosophy, according to Bertrand Russell, is the notion of liberating doubt. You start with a belief, and then you question it. And the idea is no belief is off limits. Everything can be questioned, including whether you should question all your beliefs. This is why philosophers get nothing done. It's so true. You question your beliefs and you examine the reasons why you hold them. And you go through a process of doubt. And this doubt frees you from having to think the way you've always thought. And then you examine why you held it, see if those are good reasons, and if they are good reasons, if you're satisfied with them, then you return to a state of belief. But that new state now is perhaps the same belief, but with a different foundation, a better foundation. Perhaps once you examine your beliefs, you'll toss them out. Perhaps you'll return to them. But whatever, belief, doubt, belief with a better foundation. And that, in a nutshell, is philosophy. Now, why philosophy is obnoxious is because that middle phase of doubting, if I do my job well, you will be uncomfortable. Also, as I tell my students, if I have done my job well, at the end of the semester, you leave my class knowing less than you did when you showed up. What Jeff and Indy have talked about today is science and all sorts of information. What I am now going to do is to be obnoxious and point out that they have no clue what they're talking about. And if you listened to them very carefully, they both admitted it, and as you kept trying to ask Indy questions and pin her down, well, give me this, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this. And she kept going, we don't know, we don't know. And then someone asked, what should we do? Science education. Well, guess what? Science education is not facts. The thing we need for science education is to understand what science can and cannot do. That's what's important. Because if we put too much weight on science, if we have too great a reliance on science, if our expectations of science are such that no matter what the problem is, we turn to science for the answer, we're not going to make it. So be uncomfortable with your reliance on science. You're wrong to have that degree of faith in science. Because the science that Jeff and Indy are talking about, the science that all of us are turning to for answers, is a newborn in terms of human development. Science, as we understand it, has only been around for 500 years at most. Before that came 800 years of alchemy, which is what I'm going to talk about. And before that, we had the Dark Ages. And before that, we had Aristotle. And before that, we had Plato. And before that, we had the PreSocratics. And before that, we didn't have much. In the Western world, and I want to be very clear, everything I'm talking about is Western philosophy, not Eastern. They had an entirely different line of development. So, now I have to do this. This is me being high-tech, okay? So, in order for you to have a true understanding of science, you have to understand, so we're going to put science down here. I have horrible handwriting, just deal with it. This is where it truly becomes a Saturday university. I'm treating you like my students. Cope, deal with it, figure it out. In order to understand science, you have to understand where science came from, the scientific revolution, which happened about 1500 AD, so 500 years ago. In order to understand the scientific revolution, you have to understand what they were in revolt against, which is something called scholastic science. Scholastic science is the science of the Middle Ages, the science of scholastic philosophy. This is alchemy. This is where alchemy occurs. Now, this stuff went on for about 800 years. And in order to understand scholastic philosophy or medieval philosophy, same thing, in order to understand this, you have to understand where it came from. And we're skipping over the Dark Ages because not a whole lot happened. In order to understand scholastic philosophy, you have to understand Aristotle. Okay? In order to understand Aristotle, you have to understand Plato. In order to understand Plato, you have to understand the PreSocratic, this is where it really, the PreSocratic philosophers. And fortunately, because I'm out of room, in order to understand PreSocratic philosophy, you have to understand a guy named Thales. Now, I realize that's in the shadow and you can't read it, so I'm going to do more with it in a minute. But here's the problem. Science education, in order to understand science, you got to understand this stuff. So, what am I going to do today? This is 2,500 years, and I'm going to get you all the way through it. Okay? Speaking of alchemy and magic, yeah. Now, Thales started about 600 years ago. And what Thales, he's credited as the first Western philosopher. And here's what Thales did. No one else had ever worried about this stuff until Thales. And Thales looked around, and he noticed that there was all of this stuff, and it was all so different. But what he said is it just that there's differences? Or is there something the same there in all that which is different? So, look around the room. Look at all the different people in the room. All right? This is why, again, I'm going to treat you as my students. Look! You're not looking. Look around the room. You're all getting C's about right now. Look how different you are, but also look how similar you are. And what Thales wanted to know was that, is there some underlying reality by virtue of which all those beings which are human are in fact human? What makes a human a human? He was also concerned about dogs and plants and physical stuff in general. So now look around the room. We have all of this different physical stuff. We have flesh, we have cloth, we have hair, we have wood, we have whatever the hell these things are made out of. We have fabric. Now, is there some underlying reality that all these physical things have in common? Is there physical stuff itself? Is there one nature that is shared by all physical things? And if so, what on earth is it? This question he had, is there one thing that is there that underlies all the different things, came to be called, not too surprisingly, the problem of the one, reality, and the many, all the ways in which reality appears to us. All right, think about this for a moment. Suppose I want an egg for breakfast, and I have a hen house in my backyard. And I go out, and I wait on the chicken, and I'm going to rely on my own childhood right now. The chicken's name is Miss Hilda. And I rely on Miss Hilda to lay the egg, and she's slow, so I have to just sit there and wait. And eventually it pops out of her back end, because that's where the eggs come from. It's kind of disgusting when you think about it. Here comes this egg. Now, I take the egg into the house, and I crack it open. And out pours this clear gelatinous goo, right? And then there's the yellow junk too, but the clear goo is what I'm concerned with right now. It's clear and slimy, right? and I drop it in a frying pan full of hot oil. And the clear slime begins to turn into a white rubber. I don't like eggs. So what I am seeing as an appearance of an egg goes from clear slime to white rubber. And then the phone rings, and it's my mother, which means I don't get off the phone for 45 minutes. By the time I get back to the kitchen, the egg is completely burned up. The pan is basically burned up. None of the smoke detectors have gone off because I took the batteries out a long time ago because they kept going off. Worry about that. Now, what I have is something that at one time was clear goo. Then it was white rubber. Now it is black ash. Is it the same thing? Well, certainly if I go by how it appears to me, I have three different objects. But no one thinks that the clear goo object went out of existence, was taken out somehow by God or something, and God plops down some white rubber substance. And then later God zaps that one out of existence and plops down black ash. No one thinks that. This would be replacement, that one object is replaced with another object. No one thinks that. What we think is there is one thing, and this one thing is capable of staying the same even though it has gone through change. Now, when you really think about that, it is utterly incomprehensible. If you're not confused right now, you're not thinking hard enough. How can something that is different be the same? What is it that stays the same as it is different? It's an odd question. Thales asked it. It's the problem of the one and the many. How can there be one egg with many different stages? What is the same throughout the change? And there has to be something that is the same throughout change. Otherwise, we have replacement. And nobody thinks it's being replaced. We think it's change. How is change possible? That was the very first philosophical question. How is change possible? Because change seems to require that something stay the same while it doesn't stay the same, which is a logical impossibility. Okay? Now, Thales came up with an answer. You're not going to like it. No one did. Thales said the one reality which is there for all things that are different is, you ready? Water. Told you wouldn't like it. Now, it actually is a really super cool answer. Here's why. Water comes in three forms. It is solid, it is liquid, it is gas. And it is very commonly found as solid, liquid, and gas. Water comes up from the ground. Water comes down from the sky. Everything needs it. It is everywhere. Thales lived in Greece, oceans, islands. Water was everywhere. Nowhere did you go where you didn't have it. Coming down from above, coming up from the ground, in all states. So, what am I wearing right now? I am wearing water in a dry form. What are the chairs? Water in a fabric form. That was the answer. And again, no, silly answer. Now, after Thales, lost my marker, hold on. After Thales came the PreSocratics. The PreSocratics are simply the philosophers prior to Socrates. Philosophers are not very original in coming up with their names. The PreSocratics looked at what Thales said, and they said, God, that's a lousy answer. Let's see if we can do better. And one of the criticisms they gave to Thales was that by only having water, he didn't have any way of explaining whatever caused water to begin to react differently to cause it to be dry here while wet in my thermos. What would cause water to begin to go through changes? If there was only one reality, it would seem to be stable. And so the PreSocratics said, well, you need two realities that interact with each other, and it's the tension between the reaction that causes water to enter into the different states. And then other PreSocratics said, no, that won't work, and they came up with, this went on for centuries. Another set of PreSocratics came up with a claim that you actually need 4 elements, not 1, not 2, but you need 4. Earth, air, fire, and water. Have you heard of the 4 elements? That's where it comes from. It is trying to deal with the problem of the one and the many and not liking Thales' answer. Another PreSocratic, a guy named Heraclitus, answer it. A philosopher named Heraclitus denied the one. He said, if you look at what your senses are telling you, your senses do not tell you that there is any underlying permanent reality. All your senses tell you is that there is change. All the senses tell you is that things are different. Your senses never tell you that there is one reality or two realities. It doesn't tell you anything about reality at all. All you know is that there is change. And so Heraclitus said, what is reality? Reality is nothing but change. Along came another philosopher. His name was Parmenides. He said Heraclitus is completely wrong. And by the way, you should be getting to see a theme of how philosophy works. Parmenides said Heraclitus is wrong because Heraclitus says there is nothing that is permanent. There is only the changing. And Parmenides said that would mean that we have something, change, which comes from nothing, reality. But you can't have something come from nothing. Because if something, well, if something exists, it has to come from something. It can't come from nothing. Therefore, since there is something, change, there can't be nothing. There must be something. Therefore, there can't be the nothing that is reality. There must be something that is reality. Therefore, Heraclitus must be wrong for logical reasons. If you didn't follow that one, that's okay. That one's kind of complicated. Now, this goes on. It goes on and on and on. It's just insane. About 300 BC, 350 BC, something like that. Along comes the philosopher Plato. Plato looked at all the PreSocratics, and Plato said, all of you guys have it wrong. And the reason you all have it wrong is because all of the PreSocratics were trying to give an account of the one and the many by working only within this world. And Plato said what's really going on, we call this the divided line theory. Plato said there are 2 realms. We have here the realm that's a U, by the way. I can spell, I just can't write. We have here the realm of the sensible particular. Now, sensible here does not mean anything like wearing good shoes in winter, as I come to Jackson in October wearing sandals. Sensible here means capable of being grasped by the senses. And a particular is the individuals. So here we have the realm of sensible particulars. So basically, this is the realm that our senses tell us about. This is the realm where we see things as they appear to us. So this is the realm of appearances. And what actually appears to us? Nothing but things in a constant state of change. So here we have the world of change, or what's often called becoming. All right? This is the world we're in right now. But in this world, we need some way to explain appearances. So Plato postulated a second world, or a second realm. And this is called the realm of the forms. So if you've ever heard about platonic love or something like that, and it basically meant you were getting dumped, what it actually means is the ideal, the true nature, or the essence. And what we're really, really interested in here is the notion of essence. So I want you to think about this. Take the poor little egg when it's white, clear goo, white rubber, black ash. In virtue of what is it an egg, regardless of the appearance? And Plato said it's an egg because in the realm of the form, there exists the form eggness. This is the true nature, the essence of what an egg is. All right, so now think about Lassie and Fido and Spot and Rover and Dalmatians and Chihuahuas. Think about all the differences you find with dogs. By virtue of what are all these creatures dogs? Plato said they all participate in the form dogness. All right? Now, okay, and eggs and dogs, that's really trivial. They're just examples. But now let's move on to important philosophical issues, such as the nature of beauty. We've all heard things like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Plato said, absolutely not. It's an objective fact whether something is beautiful or not. So, I want you to think of the most beautiful woman. Just because I need an example, it's going to be Angelina Jolie. Now I want you to think of the most beautiful man. Simplicity leads to Brad Pitt. All right? Here are two beautiful beings. What do they have in common? Of course, children. But what do they have in common? All right, now let's go to a red rose. Even if it's not your favorite flower, red roses are beautiful. All right, now, one more. I want you to think of the Tetons in the middle of the winter when they're covered in snow at sunrise. Is there anything more beautiful than the Tetons in the morning in the snow? Oh my God, they're incredible. So, what is it that is the same for Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt, Red Rose, and the Tetons? What do they have in common? And the answer is, they all participate in the form of beauty. That's the theory of the forms. And it actually does a lot. Now, I'm trying to get you through 2,500 years of philosophy. Well, actually, 2,600 years of philosophy, I think. I'm a philosopher, not a mathematician. I have no idea how long it's been. I'm going to have to do this quickly, and I'm going to leave out a lot. So just trust me. The theory is actually pretty sophisticated. As I've given it, you're like, that's kind of simple. But it works to explain how it is that all of us who are human, what do we have in common by virtue of which we are human? Humanity. What is humanity? It is the ideal, the true nature, the essence of what it is to be human. But the important thing here is that for Plato, beauty itself was a real, actual thing. It just didn't exist in this world. It existed in a different world. Down here we have the world of the sensible, that which can be grasped by the senses. The forms exist in a different realm, and the forms are intelligible. I don't know, whatever. Intelligible. And the word intelligible means that they can be grasped by the intellect. So, the form dog does not have 4 legs and a waggy tail and bad breath. The form dog is not physical in any manner, shape, or form. It is an essence. It is an ideal. It is not a concept, because a concept makes it just an idea that we have. Plato said these things have an objective reality. They exist quite apart from humans. They existed before humans. They will exist after humans. They always have existed. They always will. They are eternal. They are perfect. They are unchanging. They have a higher degree of reality. And they are the source or cause of everything down here in this realm being what it is. If I happen to be holding a beautiful egg, then I have something that is participating both in the form of beauty and in the form of eggness. Okay? This is Plato. Now, you're not going to believe what happens next. Along comes Aristotle. Aristotle was the student of Plato. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. He was a bad student, so he went off and beat up everybody. Actually, I have no idea if he was a good student or not. I have no idea. Anyhow, Aristotle looked at Plato's theory of the forms, where he had 2 realms. And Aristotle said, this theory won't work. And the reason Plato's theory wouldn't work is because Plato said the forms are the explanation of the things in the sensible world. But the forms are intelligible, non-physical, eternal, and unchanging. Aristotle said, how can something with those traits be the cause of something with traits that are completely different? How can Plato's forms actually serve as an explanation? How can they explain what they're supposed to explain? And the answer is, they can't. So Aristotle came up with a different theory. Plato's forms existed in a separate realm, and they had a different type of existence. Plato's forms were transcendent forms. They transcended the physical world. Aristotle said, if you take forms out of this world, they can't do what we need them to do, which is to make something be the kind of thing it is. So Aristotle yanked forms out of a transcendent realm and put them back in the physical realm. He liked the idea of forms. He thought Plato was right, that we need the ideal, the true nature, or the essence. But what he didn't like was that the forms were transcendent. So Aristotle kept forms as essences. That's an S. But he made them immanent, which is basically embodied. He made them part of the physical world. And then he said, what we really need to understand, this is a lot of terminology. What we really need to understand is that every single thing that exists is hylomorphic. Now, what does that mean? You know what it means for something to morph or to have a morphology, transform, all of that. It simply means it has a shape or it has a form. The word hylo is simply matter or stuff. So what Aristotle said was that everything that exists has to have both form and matter. You will never have form just out there on its own, but neither will you ever have pure matter that is just undifferentiated stuff. If it exists, it has to exist as a kind or type of thing. So what would matter be? Just matter. Here I have fabric matter. Here I have flesh matter. Here I have wood matter. But what would matter itself be? And it's incomprehensible. We can only think of matter as a type or kind of thing. But the type or kind of thing it is determined by its shape or form. But you never have a shape or form existing but what it is instantiated in some stuff. Now, fear not, we're staying with Aristotle. Aristotle said, if you want to know about something, and he did, one of the biggest differences between Plato and Aristotle is that Plato dealt with very abstract concepts, and he separated the world and talked about this theoretical world that was abstract, that we could never know about through our senses. He didn't care about the world we inhabited. He cared about the world of the forms. Aristotle is credited with being the very first biologist. Aristotle said, let's go out and look at the world. And what he found was he never found stuff. He only found kinds of stuff. And so he started categorizing all the different kinds of stuff. And Aristotle started science. You're like, I was wondering when she's going to get to that. This is the beginning of science, Western science. And what Aristotle said was, what we want to do is to come to know the world. And Indy began her talk with a definition of science. And I was like, this is so cool. Here's what she said: a systematic attempt to understand the universe. And Aristotle would have agreed 100%. The difference is what Aristotle took as a systematic attempt is very different than what the systematic attempt today would be. Here's how Aristotle thought you did science. He said there are 4 causes. And if you want to know the truth about anything, you need to know its 4 causes. And what are the 4 causes? The first one is the material cause. In other words, this, the hylo part of hylomorphism. What is it made out of? The second part, or the second cause, is the formal cause, which is this, the morph part of hylomorphism. We need to know what kind of thing it is. But there are 4 causes, and he goes on. The next thing you need to know is the efficient cause. And the efficient cause is how something came to be. And then we get into the most important one, which is the final cause. And Aristotle said, if you can answer these 4 questions about something, then you know everything you need to know about it. And if you can go and answer this for everything in the world, you will understand the world. You have accomplished science. This is it. So let me take you through this quickly. Imagine The wooden floor. Yeah, I don't like that. The chair behind us. There's 4 of them. You can see one of them. The chair, the material cause, it's made out of wood and fabric and stuffing. That's the material cause. The formal cause, the shape of it is what allows it to be a chair, right? If it had a particularly different shape, like perhaps that, but couldn't sit on it, wouldn't be a chair. So the formal cause is what makes it the kind of thing it is. Efficient cause, how did it come to be? And the answer is a carpenter made it. Final cause, what is its purpose, its reason for being? Or, when I write it in really big print like that, it means it'll be on the exam. What is its telos, its purpose, its aim, its reason for being? What is the telos of a chair? To provide a place for people to sit. All right? So, now let's go through this for a human being, because Aristotle said it's for everything. So, what is the material cause of a human being? Flesh and bone, right? What is the formal cause? Shape. If you don't have the right shape, according to Aristotle and according to the Council of Vienna in 1322, if you don't have the right shape, you are not a human being. Efficient cause. Your parents had sex. Now, when I say this to my 18-year-olds, they all scream. But this is the efficient cause of how a human came to be. Reproduction. Final cause. What is the purpose or the telos of a human being? The answer? To live the good life. And what is the good life? It is the life dictated by a lifetime commitment to the virtues, and you know what the virtues are by exercising your capacity for rational thinking. So, you want to know what the good life is? Being a virtuous person, seeking the mean between extremes in behavior, and you know all that in virtue of your rationality. So basically, being a rational being is the purpose of being human. This is Aristotle. Now, somewhere in here I have notes. Hold on. I needed dates. Aristotle lived, never know dates. From 384 to 322 BC. So, at the time of Aristotle, this is science. It's very important you understand this is science. Okay, now, what happened? Well, what happened, a number of things happened actually. Alexander the Great went out, conquered the world. Christianity got started, and we had the Dark Ages. During the Dark Ages, the works of the PreSocratics, Plato, and Aristotle were viewed as heresy. Because, of course, they weren't Christian, because, of course, they weren't, because Christ hadn't been born yet. It's not like they had a choice, so it's a little unfair. But the work was viewed as heresy, so it had to be destroyed. And huge amounts of pre-Socratic philosophy is lost forever. It was destroyed. A fair amount of Plato and Aristotle was also destroyed. Arabic and Jewish philosophers saved what they could. That we know anything about what the pre-Socratic, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that we know what they said is because of Arabic and Jewish scholars taking it and hiding it throughout the Dark Ages. As we come out of the Dark Ages, which is going to be about, I don't know, I'm going to make the dates up to some extent, around 800 AD, we begin the period known as medieval philosophy. And what happened in medieval philosophy is that they took the the church teachings. The Catholic Church by this time was incredibly powerful. It was the institution of Europe and further, but boom, there it was, powerful. The teachings had to be approved by the Catholic Church. But as we left the Dark Ages and entered medieval time periods, the work of Plato and Aristotle began to be approved, accepted, embraced, especially the work of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had form embedded in matter, the hylomorphic concept. This is essential, okay? What happened is the Catholic Church had to figure out some way to take Catholic dogma and combine it, unite it with Aristotelian theory of reality. All right? And if you're wondering how is that going to work, the answer is it doesn't. It was a disaster. But that's also what is known as medieval philosophy. That's what medieval philosophy is. Trying to get Aristotelian metaphysics, Aristotelian theory of reality and science to be in accordance with church doctrine. Now, here's how it works. Aristotle said that everything has a purpose, that everything that is, not just living things, but everything has a telos, a purpose, a reason for being. But notice here in these four causes, what is it made of? What is it? What kind of thing is it? How did it come to be? And it's the efficient cause, like a carpenter made the chair, your parents had sex. And then the final cause, telos. Nowhere in this is there any discussion of God. It's just not there. It wasn't there at all in Aristotelian metaphysics. So, what do you do if you want to make God in here? You simply say, what is the final cause? What is the telos? What is the purpose? It is to be in accordance with God's will. Now, one of the big things that went on for several hundred years, from about 800, 700, 800 AD, up until about 1500 AD, and right here is where the scientific revolution got started. What happened from this time to this time was an attempt to come to know the mind of God. This is the quest. You want to understand what God wants you to do. You want to come to know God. But here's what they were thinking. Now we have to erase Aristotle. We have now natural theology. Natural theology goes as follows. God is the creator of all things. God created the world. Nothing is more powerful than God. So, God was able to create the world exactly as he wanted it to be. So, the world is created according to God's plan. So we go back to the notion of telos. Everything has a purpose. What is your purpose? It is God's purpose for you. This is very common terminology anymore, right? I'm doing God's will. Everything happens as God intended it to happen. So what were the scientists doing? One thing you need to be very aware of is during this whole time period, going back to the PreSocratics, throughout all of this up to the scientific revolution, there is no distinction at all between philosophy, science, and theology. It's the exact same discipline. Come to understand the world because God created it. So you toss theology in, you're doing science. What is science? Coming to understand the world. Theology, coming to understand God. Natural theology, you come to understand God by studying God's works because God has it the way he wants it to be. So we say, oh, well, it's natural, meaning it's good. If we say of something it's unnatural, we mean it's bad or a sin. It goes against God's will. We still use this terminology all the time. This terminology is from this time period. It is God's will. It is natural. So we study the way the world is. Now, here's what happened. The people who were studying the world, trying to come to an understanding of God, those were the alchemists. There were any number of ways of coming to understand God. Some people just prayed a lot. Other people went out and tried to understand the world. The ones who chose to go out and study the world as a way to coming to know God were the alchemists. Now, how exactly does this work? One of the things you need to understand about alchemy is that it lasted for several hundred years. And anytime you've got anything that lasts for several hundred years, it gets pretty murky after a while. But here's what the alchemists were doing. They took the Aristotelian notion of an embodied or embedded form, which was the essence of something, right? Its true nature or its ideal. Hylomorphism, you never have one without the other. The essence is that which cannot be separated from a body. Okay, this is important. Essence cannot be separated from body. So said Aristotle. The Catholic Church now embraces Aristotle, but they want to make it fit with Catholic theology. You want to come to know the mind of God. Well, what's the best way to come to know how God is? To study something that is muddy and impure, or to study something that is pure and of the essence? Which one is God really going to be found in? A clump of ore that might or might not have some gold in it, or a clump of pure gold? Where are you going to find the mind of God most revealed? So you hear of alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. This is why. It gets a little more complicated. Everything has a telos. Everything has a purpose. And according to Aristotle, everything is striving to become what it should be by its very nature. Why does your heart pump? Because that's what a heart's telos is. That's what makes the heart pump. It's telos. It's trying to do what it is that it is designed to do. What it is, well, no, I can't say that. It's not that it is designed to do. There was no question of design, not for Aristotle. It's just brute fact, that's what a heart does. But when you start putting in Christian theology, then you get the heart is designed to pump. It is serving God's purpose. God designed the heart to pump. The idea is everything is like this. Everything, whether it's living or not, everything has a telos, a way of being. And so in trying to turn lead into gold, what they were actually doing was thinking, it was just a mistake on their part, but they thought all the minerals were in fact of the same kind, but at different stages of development. All right? So think about this. You have a chicken egg. Yeah, we're back to the eggs. You have a chicken egg. This one's fertilized. What do? If you want it to hatch more quickly, you put it in an incubator. So what the alchemists did was they took any number of metals that they wanted to have in its pure form. And what they did was they wanted to speed it on its journey. And so they would take the one thing they were fascinated by was mercury, called quicksilver, right? And when I talk to my students who are fairly young, they've never done this, but you guys are probably old enough. Remember breaking open thermometers and getting lots of mercury and playing with it? Yeah. My students are horrified by this, but no, it's lots of fun. Mercury was fascinating because mercury was called the water that does not make your hands wet. Isn't that a great name for it? It was also called quicksilver because it runs everywhere when you drop it. What they wanted was to get mercury because to them there was something fascinating with mercury, and they wanted pure mercury. They wanted pure gold. So they would take lead or any other substance. They would take cinnabar, and cinnabar is what they thought contained the essence of mercury, and they thought lead contained the essence of gold. And then they would take these different substances and they would put them in a giant autoclave or an oven, which was called the philosopher's egg. So getting back to eggs. The philosopher's egg. And it was basically a huge oven. They would put these minerals in there, and then they would put other things in as a catalyst to get some sort of reaction going, but it was pure trial and error on their part. They would then seal the egg. It's the egg. They would bury it deep into a fire pit and heap lots of coals on it. And they would cook it for weeks at a time. Now, think about this. You're going to take a bunch of cinnabar, which contains mercury. You're going to cook it to incredibly high temperatures. And whenever I need facts, I have to go to my notes. The temperature was 932 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot. They would cook cinnabar until, again, it's scientific stuff, I never know what it means. For mercury, the main sulfide ore was roasted to produce the oxide HGO, which decomposed at about 930 degrees Fahrenheit into oxygen and mercury. Since the metal boils at 675 degrees Fahrenheit, it left the furnace as a highly toxic vapor. Oops. What the alchemist would do would be to put cinnabar in and cook it and stay out there fasting and praying for weeks at a time. And ever so often lift open the egg and stir it up some more. And what they were doing was smelting. Because think about this. The form cannot be separated from matter. The essence cannot be separated from matter. So when you lift it up, if some crap has, it's called slag, I think. If it's gone to the surface, you skim it off. If you can skim it off, you're separating it from the matter. Therefore, it must not be the essence. What they were trying to do was to actually find a genuine essence. Remember those bars of soap when we were little kids that had the toy in them? And if you washed your hands, eventually you get rid of all the soap and there'd be the little toy? That's kind of what they were doing. What the alchemists did, and it was a mistake on their part, they reified Aristotelian forms. And to reify something is to take something which is theoretical or abstract and treat it as if it were concrete. And the alchemists, because again, this went on for several hundred years, they said, if I can find the essence, I will know what God really thought. And everything has a telos, so I'm going to speed gold on its journey. And I'm going to incubate it and get it to simply grow into gold that much faster. And I'm going to keep cooking it and skimming all the stuff off the top until nothing else can be skimmed off. And this is why they kept dumping in more things to work as a catalyst, because they needed more reactions so they could start skimming off even more stuff. And eventually, after weeks and weeks of staying pure and praying and fasting and breathing in toxic mercury vapors, eventually nothing would be left but perhaps some little puddle of something. And they said, now we have the true revelation of the mind of God. But the idea was that only those who were deserving would God allow to see the truth. So it was far more important that your soul was pure than that you cleaned out the egg each time between experiments. It was all about whether you are worthy of having God reveal himself to you through your experiments, because you were not doing the experiments to come to know the world for its own sake. You were doing the experiments because if you could know the world as it really is, apart from all the corruption of the physical and the impurity, apart from any corruption of your own soul, then you would see God as he truly intended himself to be seen. And the other thing that goes on with alchemy is they write in extremely obscure, cryptic language. They talk about the green lion devouring the sun. And what does that mean? Basically, it's a chemical formula. But it's written in code because each alchemist was convinced that they were the one that God would reveal the truth to. At the time that the scientific revolution happened, there were, I think, 26 different definitions of gold, depending on which alchemist you were talking to. They screwed up in so many ways, but I want you to think about why it made sense to them to do what they were doing. Because we think, oh my God, you can't, no, this is silly, turning lead into gold. But if your entire worldview says that everything is created by God and everything has a purpose and everything is striving to achieve that purpose, and you know perfectly well you can incubate eggs and get chickens faster, it makes perfect sense to incubate gold. And if what you want is to see God in his true form, as he will reveal himself to you, you want the essence, the true nature, then it makes sense if you have your entire mindset is the Aristotelian hylomorphic conception to say, if I can separate something, if I can smelt it off and pull off the slag, then it must not be the essence, because the essence cannot be separated. It makes perfect sense. Now, here's important things to think about. The assumptions that the alchemists were working under included such things as the world is too mysterious for the average person to come to know. The world can be understood only by those who have proven themselves worthy for God to reveal the truth of the world to them. All right? Now, when Jeff and Indy were both talking, what is one of the assumptions they were making? What is one of the assumptions everyone in this room is making about science? And that is, anyone can figure something out about the world. That anyone can be a scientist. Alchemy said absolutely not. That's heresy. Now, what happened is, this went on for hundreds of years, but about 1600, what happened was the scientific revolution. See, you didn't think I could get there, but I did. The scientific revolution challenges these assumptions that the alchemists were making. And the primary assumptions that are being challenged, let me give them to you right quick. Here are the assumptions that we now take for granted. We who believe in science, here's what we think. That the world is fixed. That the world is not constantly changing. That there is a solidity, a reality. That is actually an assumption we are making. Heraclitus certainly didn't believe it. It's not clear if the alchemists believed it, because it may be God revealed the truth to them, but if they went out and engaged in debauchery as soon as they got a truth, it's like, yay, let's go party. Maybe God would then change it on them to punish them. So the idea that the world is going to stay put, and once we discover something, it's going to still be there. Indy, one of the things she talked about was repeatability. Repeatability is of value only if the world stays put. The world stays the same. And guess what? That's an assumption you're making. And it is a recent assumption. That assumption is, at most, 500 years old. Here's another assumption, that the laws are finite. There's only so many of them. The alchemists thought there was no end to it. God is infinite. The ways of understanding God are infinite. The ways in which God acts are infinite. The idea that there's a set number of laws, 3 laws of thermodynamics? That's a lot less than an infinite. That assumption is recent. It's about 500 years old. Here's another one. Human beings have the capacity to come to know these laws. The world is such, and our minds are such, that they're compatible. We have the capacity to understand the world, not according to the alchemists. And it makes perfect sense for them to think the way they think, given the time period they were working in. So, big question here. What assumptions are we working under today that drive our science? I read you some of them. They are assumptions, and they are recent assumptions. And what should we then think about science? That science is in a very new developmental stage. Incredible stuff is being done. But in 200 years, the Humanities Council will have someone else come give a talk, and they're going to point out how silly the ecologists are, just as I am now pointing out how silly the alchemists are. Ecology is an incredibly new science. It is less than 100 years old. Actually, it's about 100, a little over 100, around 100. Ecology is often known as the subversive science. Why? Because once we had the scientific revolution, everything started changing, and we said the church is no longer the authority on scientific matters. What happened with scientific revolution? What was the revolution? The main one was separation of science from the church. Other one was go out and do experiments. You need to do experiments rather than pray. I mean, Jeff wrote a book on grasshoppers. How did he come to have the knowledge of the grasshopper? I'm pretty sure, not positive because it's Jeff, but I'm pretty sure he did not smell mercury vapors and try to get into the mind of a grasshopper. Maybe. Well, I read the book. You did to some extent. How did we do science? We now have the scientific method. You do experiments. You have a hypothesis. You go out and you test it. You have confirmation. You have falsifiability. There's an entire branch of philosophy called philosophy of science that explores not any particular scientific discipline, but the very nature of science itself and how we have come to have the scientific method and why we think the scientific method we have today is the best way of going out and getting knowledge about the way the world is. The person who teaches philosophy of science is actually the husband of the woman videotaping right now. That's a colleague of mine, Franz Peter Griesmeyer. His whole career is exploring what it means to do science, what it actually is. And the method that ecologists, even though it's new and frightening because they want to do holistic thinking rather than break things down analytic thinking, it's a very new way of doing science. But even the ecologist, hardcore chemist, everybody follows a method called the scientific method. But what you need to understand is that method is really, really new, and it's still being developed. And that's what science is today. And that's why you can't understand all of that unless you understood everything else. Thank you. I have 15 minutes. Should I take questions? Anything? Yeah, y'all are just stunned. I'm so sorry. See, I told you they put us last for a reason. Yes?
All of us, when we think of assume that is just one example. Is that
It is just one example. Mercury is the other example, but gold was in fact the main thing they worked with because gold was considered to be incorruptible. All the other metals would erode except gold. And so you didn't find gold decaying or going backwards. And so the reason why you would incubate lead to get it to turn into gold was the thought was gold is the most mature of the metals. And so basically, yeah, it was worth lots of money, but the idea was there was something about gold that made it special. And so all the work really was trying to get gold, because once you got gold, all the different minerals were at the end of their journey, and you had the mature element, which was then the best expression of God's intent. So it really was about gold. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts nowadays about the relation between science and religion? I mean, you really went into some detail about how powerful the church became
Yes.
at the beginning of Christianity.
Yeah.
I guess, how do you see the relationship?
One of the things that allowed the scientific revolution to happen when it did was because the church was losing power anyway. What you find socially at the time is the rise of a merchant class. You find that education is spreading beyond just the priest. You find, the phrase is the rise of the individual, and that people begin to start thinking of themselves as individuals. We talk about human rights all the time. The very first instance we know that the word right shows up in anything written by anyone ever is in the 12th century by a Spanish monk. So the notion of rights didn't exist until the 12th century. And so you begin to get the rise of the individual, the setting sun of the power of the church. All of this goes together and allows for the scientific revolution to happen when it does. The relationship between science and religion today, as far as I know, they're completely separate, and the church basically says science is an independent discipline. And I don't know, Paul, you're going to be the religious scholar here. Is there any, well, we have, of course, creationism and evolution, and I'm not going there. Except, oh wait, I will go there. Creationists are wrong. Now, but Paul, do you have anything to say about what religion today says about science? I don't know.
Well, just a quick response is that most forms of Christianity today, for example, spend a good deal of time trying to navigate their way in what I would call a larger problem, not just science, but modernity,
Yeah.
which is, the knowledge of other religions, a shift in the church's temporal power, as you've been pointing out, and the issue of science to explain things that used to only be explainable within the context of religion.
Yeah, I mean, to say because God set it up is a great answer. But if you leave that out, you've then got to worry about all sorts of other things. Also, the Catholic Church only 10 years ago admitted that they were wrong about Galileo. Is it 10, 15 years?
That's overstating it, but yeah. They had a formal apology.
They gave the formal apology only about 10 or 15 years ago. Yes?
I didn't understand when you were talking about if you gave this, somebody came and gave this lecture 100 or 200 years from now with the point about ecology, it made me think, besides you answering that, from where you're sitting and you look at the assumptions we now have for science, do you have any sense of any of those assumptions that seem shaky or, obviously 5 or 1,000 years from now, we're going to have something very different. We have no crystal ball, we don't know. But where you're sitting, which ones might be moving?
Well, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know any scientific field well enough to make any speculations at all. But from where I'm sitting, what I would say is, within the paradigm, and the paradigm is a technical word, Thomas Kuhn, famous philosophy of science guy, said, within a paradigm, everything makes sense. And so the alchemists had a different paradigm, and the point of my talk was, in their paradigm, it makes perfect sense. We're now in a different paradigm. Kuhn said, from within a paradigm, you can't see your paradigm. So my response is, I can't see which of my assumptions are questionable because that's the very nature of assumptions. Now, what I can do, just as a philosopher, and again, be obnoxious, is rely upon the philosopher David Hume, who said, well, do we have any reason to expect any law that has held up to now to continue to hold in the future? And so I can call into question the entire principle of induction, which all of science is based on, repeatability. I can call into question the entire notion of cause and effect. You toss that out, you don't have any science at all. You have nothing of anything. But can I question any specific scientific principle? No, because one, I'm not a scientist, and two, I am within the paradigm, and so I can't see it. Yes?
Starting with the assumption that we're all of us humans, why did Eastern philosophy evolve so differently?
Paul? You just asked me a question actually that is about religion. So Paul, why did Eastern philosophy develop so differently? By the way, in case you don't know, Paul is the director of religious studies at the university. This is why I keep going to Paul.
Thank you. The East. I could really, okay, I'm going to.
I think you've got like 5 minutes, Paul.
Okay, here's a 30-second answer, and you won't understand it. In science, and in fact, in almost all of Western thought, we have two possibilities when it comes to being. Something either is or it is not. Those are our choices. Do ghosts exist? They either do or they don't.
And that actually comes from Aristotle. It's one of the laws of thought. So it's a very grounded religious, it's a notion of non-contradiction, one of the very principles of logical thinking,
Okay.
hardcore Western Aristotle.
So if you go back to early Hinduism, sort of pre-Buddhism, pre-Jainism, all of these Eastern forms of thought, there are actually 4 forms of being. Something can either not exist, does exist, neither exists nor not exists, and the 4th is both exists and not exists. And those are extremely difficult to understand, to comprehend, and as you try to include them in an intellectual realm, just try to think about them, it pushes you beyond the rational capability of your mind into other forms of thought and meditation and so on, and explain sort of why things like Hinduism and Buddhism go much further down the meditation road and believe very different things because of that. So for example, one of the results of something neither existing nor not existing is the notion that this world is completely an illusion. So the goal of understanding this world is not to explain it, but to be able to see through it to the reality that really exists. So that's it in 3 minutes.
Yeah, and that's why I passed it off to Paul, because it actually is a religious question. And again, there's a time period where religion, philosophy, and science were all one and the same, but the Western world views religion, philosophy, and science so very differently than the Eastern. And I'm not competent to speak on Eastern religions, and Paul is. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned Kuhn's notion of a paradigm.
Yeah.
As I recall,
he emphasizes that paradigms break down because of things are beginning not to work very well within the paradigm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Now, my question is, were there examples within the practice of alchemy where it began to break down because it just wasn't working? You've emphasized the sort of theological side, but there's also the question of whether the various techniques that they were using actually were producing results that they thought they would produce.
Well, here's the problem. They thought they were getting answers. So with Kuhn, what happens is you have a scientific system, and you have all the theories and hypotheses all fit together, and then you begin to discover anomalies, and you just say, well, something went wrong with the equipment, and this builds up until you can no longer tolerate any more anomalies. You have what's called the crucial experiment. And the crucial experiment is the one where you just say, no, we're wrong, and we've been wrong all along. This new data we've got to figure out, and we go and we create a whole new paradigm to deal with the new data. Now, with the alchemist, because what they were doing was hoping God would reveal himself to them, when they found something in the bottom of the philosopher's egg after all that time, they then, think about how people can have differences of religion. They came up with answers. Gold is, and there were 26 different definitions, and they argued that I have the right one, you're just wrong. And so what we have with science today is it is important that it be public and repeatable. This is one of the assumptions. This is how to get at knowledge of the world. But the assumption the alchemists were working under was it's actually a very private thing. God's going to tell me something, and it's like reading tea leaves. You're always going to get an answer. And so they disagreed with each other as to who had the right answer. Apparently that didn't answer your question.
Can I just use that?
Sure.
Because he does give that paradigm analysis to the breakdown of Aristotelian cosmology and physics.
Yes.
And in this respect, that is what happened in alchemy, with the transition from alchemy to chemistry, different than what happened in the transition from Aristotelian physics and astronomy to modern astronomy.
And the answer I'm going to give here is probably insensitive and politically incorrect, but the difference is Aristotle wasn't relying on God as the answer to explain any and everything. And when you have God as the answer to explain any and everything, you're not going to get the paradigm shift that Kuhn was talking about, because you can account for every anomaly. Every anomaly is just that your soul wasn't pure at the moment you did the experiment. And the reason we could have the Copernican revolution and rethink all sorts of astronomy was because the people who were doing astronomy, Galileo, Copernicus, were actually doing it independently of religion, and that's why they got in so much trouble. Yeah, I know you aren't going to like that answer, but I think that's the answer. Other questions? Yes?
You refer to murkiness carrying over in disciplines that have been around for a long time.
Like philosophy?
Were you talking about anomalies appearing or changing perspectives, or what exactly?
I was being flip. Now let me see if I can give a serious answer to it. I was not thinking at all, when I said that, I was not thinking at all about Kuhn and paradigm shifts because of anomalies. I was thinking more of when you look at, oh God, I'm really going to get in trouble for this one, humanities disciplines, where it's all about talking and thinking. If you keep trying to solve the same problem for hundreds of years, you begin to chase your own tail to a certain extent. And what we find in philosophy is a problem will stay a philosophical problem for several hundred years. And we don't solve it, we decree it unsolvable. Like the question of God's existence. This was the main thing that philosophers dealt with for centuries. Very few philosophers worry about this today. Why? It has been decreed, this is something we can't know, don't spend your time on it. The other thing that happens is that in philosophy, when we really do get something figured out finally, it's not that we never make progress, it's when we do make progress, it then breaks off and becomes its own discipline. Psychology, sociology, mathematics, computer science, all of those were originally philosophical disciplines where we made progress. And in areas where we don't make progress, such as the meaning of life and does God exist, we kind of hand them over to the existentialists and ignore it. So the murkiness is, you can only spend so much time with something, and if you're not going to get somewhere, you begin to make stuff up. And Marcia's now standing up, so I think I'll be quiet.
Thanks very much, Susanna, for the mind athletics, and all of you as well. We're going to adapt our schedule and take just a very brief 5 or 10 minute break, and then we will come back to our roundtable discussion. While you are on break, please do think about feedback about the experience that you have had today. This is our first effort, and we look forward to learning from all of you what you might think about how we might enhance and improve the program. So think about that. Feel free to email Una Doherty at the Teton County Library, myself at the Wyoming Humanities Council, and Bronwyn Minton at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, and any of the Jackson residents who've been involved in the planning. And thanks very much. And it was completely inadvertent that our new board member, Paul Flesher, would be working with this program. He happens to be the director of religious studies at the university. I can't think of a better moderator for the conversation, the concluding conversation. So it worked out very serendipity in fashion, but we will enjoy that in a few minutes. Thank you. That was great.